I left diners, drive-ins, and dives on in the living room, and I don't want the echo to take place. So I'm going to stop it here and actually start um, in just a second. And yes, I watch diners, drive-ins, and dives, okay? I like Guy Fieri. I like food. Fight me. Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, everybody now knows that I watch the Food Network, and I don't apologize for it. Again, I like to eat, obviously. And Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives is a great show, so if you don't like it, skedaddle. Anyway, what are we talking about? Today, we're going to be talking about teenage girls. That sounded really gross coming out of my mouth, so we should probably clarify. Today's video, we're going to be talking about the graphic novel Ghostworld. Now, today's video is kind of interesting because we're doing something I've never really done before, which was, I'm talking about this book because it was suggested by a reader. I'm always saying, if you guys have a book that you think I might enjoy, suggest it. I can't guarantee that I'll review it right away, but I'm going to add it in my to-read stack, and then eventually I'll get to it. And Ghostworld was actually suggested to us by a video by one of my viewers by the title of Elias Rubilar Lopez. So, Elias, thanks for the suggestion, man. Really appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Okay, so, Ghostworld. This is something that if you love comics, or even if you are just kind of like a casual reader of comics, you might have stumbled across this book, or at least heard of the title, mostly because of this movie right here, Ghostworld by Terry Zwigoff. Now, this film came out, I believe, in about 2001, maybe 2003, and when it did, it came out to pretty solid reviews. It was a great movie, and I'm not just saying that because I like the comic. I loved this just as a movie itself. It's interesting to note that Terry Zwigoff was really able to direct this movie largely because he had, a couple of years previously, worked on the documentary Crumb, based on the career of the controversial cartoonist Robert Crumb, somebody we've talked about at length on this channel. But when Ghostworld came out, it really resonated with a lot of people, not just like older, cynical, white guys like me, but just viewers across the board. There's just something about Ghostworld that resonates with people. And I suspect it's largely because the book really manages, in its own weird sort of way, to capture a real-world feel to what adolescence is, which is mostly kind of like hating everything, hating everybody, kind of hating yourself at the same time, and then eventually moving forward into your adult life, and maybe growing out of that? Maybe, but not always. Ghostworld is a really interesting story for the way it tackles adolescence, as well as kind of just tackling the oddity of real world everyday experiences, which far more often than not is just encountering just how bonkers human beings can be. Now, today's video I also wanted to bring up because I'm going to try to do something different with these videos on this channel moving forward. Ever since I did my video over Black Dog by Dave McKean, I've kind of recognized that while I like sort of narrating the events of the story and dedicating a fair amount of time to this is what happens in this book, taking as much time as I have in doing them before in the past honestly feels a little bit more like a chore, and it kind of is one of the reasons why I don't always feel obligated or obliged to take the time and effort to make these videos. Like, sometimes it can be a week or more before I sit down and record one because I'm like, do I really want to sit down and narrate all the details of a story again? And then I have to find pages that sort of reveal the contents of the story. It's killing the fun of these videos, and it's taking away from, in my opinion, the important part for this channel, which is the interesting medium of comics and how people can make interesting comics and enhance a narrative through playing around with the medium itself. What does that mean? Today's video is probably going to be one of the first efforts in really sort of taking just the medium itself. So the third part of these videos, usually where I talk about what's so interesting about it, formally speaking, is probably going forward going to be the main gist. I'm still going to talk a little bit about what the stories are about, kind of like general narrative arcs and maybe one or two characters' names that you should know. But just letting you know, the viewer now moving forward, I really like doing this, and I have a lot of fun doing this. But I want to make sure that that fun is sustainable. And if I feel like I have to keep sitting down and just point by point by point narrating the whole extent of a story, we're never going to get anywhere. So, from this point on, recognize that this channel is dedicated to analyzing comics from a formal perspective. What is this medium? How does it work? Let's take a great book that I think you should read because it's great, and then let's talk about why it's great formally. So, I hope you're still on board for me with these videos. I really, really, really hope you are. So, let's get into Ghostworld and let's try to understand what exactly this book is and why has it managed to persist in people's minds for so long after it was originally published. Okay, so we've done all the introductions, what have you. Let's talk about what Ghostworld is actually about. A little backstory of Ghostworld. This book that I'm holding here right now is the actual bound trade. Now, Ghostworld did not come out, say, the way an issue of, like, this issue of Darkseid or, say, an issue of Sandman would have come out. This was not a comic that was sort of released serially over time. But at the same time, it was. Daniel Clowes had a kind of regular series called 8 Ball. That was really kind of like his slow introduction into comics, really where he kind of like cut his teeth, so to speak, and where he got his start. It was through 8 Ball that the tone of Clowes really began to be established. And Clowes, like a lot of people in the independent comic scene, had a tendency to be kind of not cynical per se, but he had a very biting wit. What happens a lot of times with sort of cisgender white male cartoonists from a particular generation is that they don't really have a very positive view of humanity, and at the same time they usually are using the medium of comics to kind of talk about alienation from other people, alienation from society, and oftentimes animosity towards other people, and 8 Ball most definitely fell into that history. Ghostworld sort of started to come out regularly through the series, and Clowes has said that one of the reasons why he made the two protagonists, and I wrote their names down as well because I wanted to figure out the full names, they are Enid Coleslaw and Rebecca Doppelmayr. You can't make this up. Seriously. Seriously. That's their names. Their full names. That's who Ghostworld is about. They're two teenage girls in a kind of nameless town in an American city set sometime in the 1990s. One of the interesting things right off the bat about Ghostworld is it feels intimately familiar if you are, say, an American citizen who grew up in a kind of smallish town. But at the same time, Clowes is really good about keeping the small details that would really focus their character in one particular place as vague or honestly as absent as possible. What this does on the reader is give you a kind of sense that this town is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, and that Enid and Rebecca are kind of just encountering almost America in its barest form. Now, Ghostworld appeared originally in small segments throughout 8 Ball, and you can read it here still, or see it still, at the beginning of each chapter. You'll see the title Ghostworld, sometimes you'll see by Dan Clowes somewhere in the shot, and that's just to sort of kind of remind the viewers, like, hey, this is not like a full graphic novel in itself. This is a collection from 8 Ball originally. This new paperback edition is actually put out regularly by Fantagraphics Press, and you can get them, or get editions like this from Fantagraphics. Now, narratively, like I said, Ghostworld is kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We see Enid and Rebecca, they're two teenage girls who are sort of still going through high school. I believe it's supposed to, they begin either as sophomores or kind of very late juniors in high school. And by the end of the book, they've both graduated and are moving into the realms of college. Enid and Rebecca basically just kind of float through life. And honestly, that's really what the book is it's Enid and Rebecca just encountering former friends from high school, air quote, friends from high school, random people that they see about their town. There's one instance where they read some guy who put out an ad in the paper going, "Hey, I saw you. Did we have a moment? Maybe call me here." They call him up, and then they basically ghost him. Ghost him. Get Ghostworld. Oh, I'm lonely. Anyway, but that kind of gives you an idea. It's basically just a story of these two young teenage girls who are kind of observing the world around them, kind of interacting with each other, and more or less just kind of being critical of everyone and everything around them. Kind of reminds me of my puberty. But that's kind of been the initial appeal of Ghostworld for a number of people, is that it feels like a realistic story of what it's like to be not just a young woman, but a young person who's kind of, one, dealing with the bullshit of puberty, but then also, two, dealing with the bullshit of getting older. By the end of the story, Enid and Rebecca, who seemed almost inseparable at the start of the book, ultimately drift apart. Rebecca falls in love with a mutual friend by the name of Josh. Hey, that's my name. That's weird. That's creepy. Ugh. Anyway, Rebecca falls in with this guy named Josh, who Enid also seems to have a small crush over, and then they more or less begin a life together while Enid basically fails at an opportunity to go to college and then moves from the town, effectively disappearing into the possibility of a new life. The story kind of begins and ends in nowhere and everywhere at the same time. And so sometimes, to me, what is interesting about Ghostworld is the way that the story feels far more often than not like you're just kind of floating. For instance, one of the opening passages of the stories are Enid and Rebecca kind of sitting there watching television, and then Enid describes meeting one of their former classmates at a diner. This guy comes in, sits down, and he's honestly just really rude to Enid, making all kind of like rude statements. He makes fun of her for being Jewish, and then introduces her to this strange man who confesses in a passage, "You see, for years I have been a prisoner of my sexual inclinations. I would never, ever harm or use a child in an inappropriate manner, and I never have, but..." And then goes on to explain how his desires are natural, and he's basically found some kind of way to sort of explore his pederastic desires in a legal way. And what is this character's response? "Hey, Tom, Enid is only 18, and Enid says, well, fuck you, John." And that's it. That's kind of the experience. Until it then shifts over to Enid, kind of forgetting that the moment just happened, and then elaborating on this pair of, as she calls them, Satanists. These man and this wife who just look like Satanists, before then also then stumbling across another man who apparently reads palms for a living. And then how does that story end? It ends with Enid sitting on the bed, reading a magazine going, "God, look at these stupid cunts." That gives you an idea, kind of narratively, but then also formalistically, how the tone of the book is going to come across. This is very much a book which is exploring puberty. But if we look at this opening passage again, you can see the formal elements that have really sort of solidified Ghostworld as an interesting book for so many people. Most of the book is predominantly in black and white, with this sort of thin bluish green that sort of constantly will either coat characters in full or else completely disappear for them. We have the black, which is framing the world as well as framing the characters as well, and it should be noted that clothes, for the most part, kind of bounces between an iconic and photorealistic style. Now, if you don't remember what iconic is, don't forget to go check out my series of videos about Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, or, here's a thought, go to your local comic book shop, pick up a copy of Understanding Comics, read it for yourself, and become learned about the way comics work. But iconic here is really meant to be more non-photorealistic. I am able to look at this photo of Enid, I am able to look at these illustrations of Enid, and I recognize them as an 18-year-old girl. It's not a possibility of being me. At the same time, because Close is dealing with a very iconic style, the reader is allowed some level of impression upon these characters, because they look like independent characters, but at the same time, they appear cartoonish enough so that their struggles can kind of become implanted onto our own. one of the sort of subtle narrative and formal structures of Ghostworld is that the reader is kind of left constantly bouncing back and forth between, like, am I Enid or am I Rebecca, judging these people who seem utterly atrocious or utterly peculiar or strange, or am I just kind of observing their reactions vicariously? It's an interesting thought. I don't know if y'all can hear the birds outside my window or my dog Sonia barking, but whatever the case, what's interesting to me right there about that is that Close is kind of setting a narrative tone by just using the medium itself. Now, let's see. I don't know why. I marked this page here, and one of the reasons I did it is because it's the scene where Enid and Rebecca stumble across the advertisement in the newspaper by the guy who thinks he may have made eye contact with a woman. They may have had an air quote moment. They call him up, leave him a message on his answering machine, and then basically watch him coming to the restaurant and then leaving once he realizes that the person isn't actually coming. This scene is important because, again, this is the scene that directly inspired Terry Zwigoff when he was constructing the movie, and thus establishing the character of Steve Buscemi in the actual film itself. But doing the Leonardo DiCaprio, there's the scene, that in and of itself is an empty gesture. What's still important about this scene, narratively speaking, is it gives us another glimpse again of the way the Close is more or less setting up his pages. What's unique about Close is he's not by any means using some of the more traditional structures that we've talked about here on this channel before. Things like the two-panel spread or the larger size panels to convey emotion or information. For the most part, these characters seem to exist over and over again in these kind of small, compact rectangles over and over again. If you look at the page, you'll note there is some play with using, say, 3 panels here, and then 2 panels here, and then 3 panels there again. But that's about the most play that the reader is really willing to get. Most of the focus is really on the emphasis of colors, or using the emphasis of what these characters are doing physically, or more importantly, what they're talking about. And on the note of talking about it, it's important as well to recognize that emotional reactions are really key to so much of the story, because even if you don't have these dialogue balloons, Close is really good at demonstrating the emotion of characters and allowing the physical expressions of these characters to do far more than the dialogue is actually doing. This book could have just as easily have been a series of talking heads, but it's not, predominantly because Close is able to communicate non-verbally through body language. If we take this passage here where Enid and Rebecca are asking themselves, I promise I won't go to college, it just occurred to me, where's Norman? There's a moment here in this panel where we get a nice sort of empty space between these two characters who are seemingly always talking, and then suddenly Enid offers up vulnerability and Rebecca kind of rejects it at this moment. This is a nice little moment in the book because it conveys Enid's growing emotional paranoia about losing Rebecca, but then at the same time also showing that the distance between them is kind of already established. And there again, the poses that they're assembling with Enid reaching over to Rebecca and Rebecca basically not responding at all, again, it's a nice, subtle gesture. And so anybody who's approaching Ghostworld from a formalistic perspective has to understand that Close is not really interested in doing grand dramatic gestures. This is not a, quote, mainstream comic at all. Rather, again, so much of the energy is about trying to understand the emotional state of the characters or their intellectual states and basically using the medium to explore those states. Again, if we look at this, a passage near the very end of the book where Enid opens up a letter from Strathmore and lets her father and stepmother know, hey, I didn't get in. But we don't have, like, an official image of, like, we don't have, like, the official, I was about to say declination. No, we don't have the official declining letter. Instead, we just get this one panel of Enid looking sad and frustrated and terrified all at the same time. Again, it's a little gesture then followed up with her saying, I told you I wasn't smart enough to pass that test. And then just a dead tree. Or at least a dying tree because it's most likely winter. Again, there's not too much play with panel layouts here. But at the same time, there is. Because again, he's allowing the content, the physical gestures of the character, the iconic quality of the character design to ultimately build up a lot of the tension that the reader feels in this story, or a lot of the emotion that the reader carries in this story. And especially when you're talking about Ghostworld, it's so much a story about growing up, about the anxiety and frustrations that come with growing up. When I was a teenager, I was an idiot. That's not me being harsh on myself, that's just fact. I was an idiot. I hated everything around me. I hated myself, and I was frustrated constantly with the way other people around me behaved because it seemed so antithetical to everything that I thought I was about at the time. And that's growing up. It sucks. It's painful. It's annoying. There's a lot of unnecessary information. And probably one of the most heartrending scenes, but honestly at the same time, beautiful scenes to me, is the last page of this book where Enid is carrying a bag. We don't know where she's going. She hasn't declared anything to herself or to the reader. She could be just grabbing a bag and hitting the road for all we know, which is almost effectively the way the movie ends. Spoiler alert, kind of. But Enid is just carrying this bag. She's walking around and she sees Rebecca in a diner, and she has that one statement that says, "You've grown into a very beautiful young woman," before she then walks to the bus stop, gets on a bus, and disappears from us forever. Again, when we talk about the end of adolescence, it's an incredibly frustrating period that far more often than not is just a constant battle between emotional strife and intellectual struggle. We're moving into who we will eventually become as people, and at the same time is that while we're doing that, things and people that were so close to us and so important to us sometimes just disappear or fade away or just go somewhere else. And so I think what's really beautiful to me about this last page is that we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 panels. 7 panels to convey in one page one of the most painful but necessary aspects of growing life, which is sometimes people just stop being a part of our lives. Again, it's subtle, but it's really, to me, more than anything else, through the formal execution of this page that Clothes is really able to dig into that aspect of our just development as adults, as people, as human beings. By not using a lot of fancy or elaborate sort of panel layouts, he's again just kind of keeping your eye focused on these people moving and interacting through space to kind of show a more internalized or a more introspective intellectual development. I'm hitting 16 minutes now, and I recognize these videos usually run for about half an hour or more, so I honestly kind of want to stop it here in terms of this analysis, but I really just want to convey, more than anything else, to me what's really interesting about Ghostworld is the formalist elements. Close keeps a very basic color palette. He has a very iconic style which runs throughout, and in terms of his panel layouts, he keeps it pretty sparse. It's usually just a couple of panels on the page, usually no more than 6 or 7. And at first, that may not encourage a lot of energy or dynamism, but again, the other elements, like the execution of color, like the execution of this iconic style, and then his physical ability, his ability at demonstrating characters' emotional complexity through physical language really goes a long way to making Ghostworld, at least in my mind, one of the most beautiful comics I've ever read. And so, if you love comics, and if you care about making comics, or just appreciating them, period, Ghostworld is definitely worth your time. It's not necessarily a happy read, but it's still an important read, because, again, when we talk about growing up and changing, sometimes it can suck. And sometimes it's frustrating. And sometimes we lose people along the way. But we do keep going. And ultimately, I guess, in its own way, Ghostworld manages to demonstrate that even if these figures do sort of just become strange ghosts in our past, at least we had them there for a moment. All right. let's do the last hurrah and then call it a day. Whew. So, Ghostworld, why should we care? We should care because it's a great coming-of-age story. And I recognize that there's dozens of coming-of-age stories, and that you could talk at length and ad nauseum about how this book sort of perfectly captures adolescence, and I kind of feel like I've contributed already to some part of that. But to me, one of the most interesting things to me about Ghostworld is how formally David Close manages to use the medium of comics to make a great coming-of-age story. Because he could have just had two characters sort of inhabiting space and having a bunch of wacky experiences and being it a kind of empty statement. But again, through the subtle execution of color, through the subtle execution of character design, and through body language, more than anything else, Close is able to tell a really interesting story, and he uses these formal elements to help you dig into Enid and Rebecca's characters so that by the end, you perceive that even though they are individual characters who've experienced so much before eventually drifting apart, we have effectively experienced the same thing. We've observed all these weird, strange, and oftentimes grotesque individuals, and we've grown. And that's a weird sensation to experience vicariously through two characters who seem just complete and utter cynics and stoics. But then hopefully we can remind ourselves, oh yeah, I was a complete and utter stoic and cynic when I was 18 years old. This is a great book. So, seriously, if you love comics, give this one a try because I think you'll absolutely love it. And thank you again, Elias. Thank you so much. I had to look down because I forgot your name again. Please forgive me. Elias Rubilar Lopez. Your name is badass, dude. I envy it so much. And thank you for getting me to sit down and read this book again because honestly, I read it like 3 or 4 years ago and I thought, okay. But I read it again, especially after watching the movie and especially after having it suggested to somebody else. And on a second look, I thought, you know, this is actually really, really solid. I'm glad I read it. And hopefully you will too. Okay, let's call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. As always, please like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It makes me know that you're enjoying these videos, that you want to see more. Don't forget, I've also started a Patreon account for this channel as well as for my visual art. There should be a link in the description section below. It may be straight to Patreon or it may be my link tree. I think it'll usually be my link tree. But hey, whatever you can do, it's $1 a month. If you can donate just $1 this month or $1 every month, I will be eternally grateful. You rock. Ghostworld. Now you can probably observe here, this label as well as this barcode on the back demonstrates this book is actually not my personal copy. I actually don't own a copy of Ghostworld. That will be soon to change. But I checked this out from my local public library. So don't forget, viewers at home, you probably live in a country that has free public libraries. Nothing's free. Your property tax is paid for your card already. Why not take advantage of something you've already paid for? Go to your library, check out their graphic novel section. If they've got the book, check it out. If they don't, ask for an interlibrary loan form, and they should be able to get it to you. Also, as I noted before, Ghostworld began to appear originally in issues of 8 Ball. That was a series that Daniel Close published early on in his career. Check your local comic book shop because, one, comic book shops are, awesome, and you should go to one. But then also, too, they might have some of the actual original issues of 8 Ball in their single stacks. You never know. And if they don't have that, they very most likely will have the bound trade. Again, this is Fantagraphics. They're a pretty reliable publisher, and from what I understand, they're pretty easy to work with in terms of most comic book shops. So your shop can probably get you a copy of the bound trade. If they don't have one on hand, they can probably order it for you. So, one last time, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.